Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Let's Talk, 3 Fierce Leadership Conversations to Transform a Culture of Nice into one of Results, sponsored by Fierce and presented by Beth Wagner. With more than 17 years of professional development experience, Beth has a unique talent for helping individuals maximize their leadership potential and propel organizational effectiveness. For the past 4 years, Beth has worked directly with the Fierce Learning Team to facilitate workshops, develop a global community of facilitators, and design content for the suite of Fierce program offerings. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that this webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI credit and can also be used for SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. After the webcast, you'll receive an email from HR.com within 1 to 2 business days that will include your certification credit information. You can also log into HR.com and go to your View My Credits page where you can see the credits that you've received. If you have any questions today for our presenter or for HR.com, please type them into the Questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. And it's now my pleasure to turn you over to Beth Wagner.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sylvie. Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon to you, depending on where in the world you're sitting. My name is Beth Wagner, as Sylvie had mentioned, and I'm a Master Facilitator at Fierce. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with all of you today to talk about this idea of a culture of nice and transforming it to get results. And it seems like it's a pretty popular topic. We've got a lot of people on the line today. So my hope today is that we can work together, come together, and figure out what is the problem we're solving for, and then how do we start to build skill to shift our results in the way that we want them to go. So without further ado, let me talk about our agenda for a minute and how we're going to get where we're going. We're going to pick apart this idea of a culture of nice. We are going to talk a little bit about why is it not a good thing, and what is the impact to our business when we know that our organization is suffering from a culture of terminal niceness. Why Fierce? I am here as a representative of Fierce and as an HR professional that has been in HR for most of my career, almost 18 years. And so I want to talk a little bit about why Fierce and partly why Fierce Conversations, and then really dive into those 3 Fierce Conversations that can help you to help yourself, your team, and your organization get the results you're looking for. And then hopefully at the end of all of this, we will have a good amount of time for some Q&A. Usually when I do these, I get some really robust, juicy questions, so I'm looking forward to that. So without further ado, let's dive in. You know, while most of us know intuitively that a healthy organizational culture is important to our success and our business's success, there really seems to be a debate going on around what actually constitutes healthy. At Fierce, we have the opportunity, the pleasure really, to speak with leaders around the globe. And it's become clear as of late that there's an emerging trend in business today that could be contributing to the culture debate. And that trend really is being nice. So when we ask leaders, how would you describe your culture? More and more often, we're hearing things like, well, everyone is always really pleasant to each other, but still something doesn't feel right. So turnover rates are high, there seems to be a lot of tension in the air, and our clients are concerned about this. Now, as an HR professional, when I hear this, all the red flags start to go up for me, because the word nice in that scenario doesn't seem so nice after all, so it's concerning. But before I go too far, I want to validate something for us, because most of us were raised to be nice to others, right? We were taught to treat others with kindness. We were taught to play nice. In business, we even used phrases like kill them with kindness or be a team player or it never hurts to be the nice guy. So our childhood teachings have actually translated to our adult beliefs that being nice is good. But here's my question, and what we're going to talk about today. Is it possible to be too nice? And we all know that too much of a good thing tends not to be a good thing, right? Ice cream is a good thing, but destroying a gallon of rocky road in one sitting is not so good, at least not for our waistlines. Sharing our opinions at work is a really good thing, but being that person that never gives anyone else a chance to speak because we're constantly running our mouth in meetings is not a good thing. So there's something to this. Now, I want to shift for a minute to talk a little bit about John Sefrin, the former CEO of the American Cancer Society, because he said something very interesting. He said when managers are too nice, they're in fact not being nice at all. And he continued by saying they're doing a disservice to the people they manage. And I want to pause here with Sefrin and dig into this a little bit, because being nice certainly has its pros in the workplace, right? I don't think we'd argue that. Genuinely nice people are usually easy to work with. They have compassion, they care about others, they tend to have pretty upstanding values, they're good people. So then what's the problem? What is Sefrin saying about being too nice? Well, what happens is that when someone is too nice in the workplace, and we'll go on to describe a little bit about what that means, their good traits take on some not so good qualities. So that trait of caring for other people can lead sometimes to avoidance of conflict, or a failure to provide timely feedback when an individual is underperforming, mainly because we're worried we might hurt their feelings, or worse, we may be seen as the not so nice person or the mean boss, right? The trait then also of being easy to work with can lead to the plight sometimes of never disagreeing, never saying no, at least not disagreeing with each other when someone has an idea that won't work or can't be implemented, because we worry that people will see us as difficult or not a team player. So if this sounds at all familiar to you, I really want you to consider how this relates to where you work. And I want to hear from this group. I don't want to just rely on what I've said so far. I'd love to get your perspective on this. So we're going to do a poll in just a minute, but I want to talk through this. How would you describe your organization's culture? And I'm going to give you 3 options. So the first one is we're too nice, right? We avoid the conflict. We maybe say what others want to hear versus what really needs to be said. So that's where we sit. Definitely too nice. Perhaps you're in the camp of we're just right. We're respectful to one another, and we deal with issues clearly and directly as they arise, even if it's dealing with difficult performance conversations or giving feedback. And then finally, too aggressive. So this is where, while our culture probably needs a little bit more nice, people aren't shying away from conflict to the point that we're wrought with mistrust and fear because there's really no skill or compassion put into those conversations. All right, so too nice, just right, or too aggressive. I'm going to ask Sylvie to launch the first poll for us, and you'll have an opportunity as a group to contribute. So I'd love to hear what you all have to say. Once again, you have 3 options: too nice, just right, and too aggressive. And as I'm looking at the way that, and I'm sure people are just starting to think about what their answers are going to be, but as I look at it right now, it seems to be the majority of people are falling into the too nice category. We've got a good number of people in just right, which I love, by the way. That is actually incredibly uplifting for me to hear that you are having those conversations. And then 15% or so far, it's good numbers going up, is too aggressive. So we're going to just leave it open for another moment. We're going to get as many responses as we can in the room, and then we're going to launch the view so you can see how people responded. Okay, Sylvia, I'm going to go ahead and call it so we can launch it and see the poll results. So once again, we had almost 50% said, yeah, that we lie in that place of too nice. About 37% said, we're doing it well. We're just right. We're in the sweet spot. And then 15% are saying, we're on the other side of the spectrum. It's a little too aggressive over here. So I just want to thank you all for your contribution and being authentic, regardless of how you answered. Really, my goal today is to share some tools that will help us all be even more effective at healthy communication, and specifically our pursuit of that balance between being nice and getting the results that we want. And I know that you can go far to the other end of too aggressive, and these tools will also help us to temper that as well. If you found yourself, 48% of you, in the too nice category, you're actually not alone. In fact, I'm going to share with you one interesting study that showed, in terms of the respondents, 40% felt their organization suffered from terminal niceness. We were at 48%, so we're actually right around the same ballpark, valuing politeness over the pursuit of the best ideas or other perspectives. Most of us who find ourselves in this culture of nice are there because we have all the right intentions. We care about our company. We want to build relationships with others. We don't want to hurt people's feelings. We want to be seen as agreeable, and we want to get results. And yet the bigger question, and the question I'm going to be asking us a few times throughout today, is this: does our intent meet our impact? Let's say, I'm going to give you an example. So let's say you refuse to talk with your boss about your workload being too much to handle because you want your boss to see you as a hard worker and a successful team player. Okay? We've all kind of done that, put our nose to the grindstone and not complained. But the reality is that your work is suffering because you just can't get to everything that's on your plate, because you haven't been able to say no or talk about that. So in this case, does your intent meet your impact? No, it doesn't. Or perhaps you've been avoiding telling your direct report that the client on their project is really unhappy with the management of that project because you don't want to upset him. You know this person's been through some stressful times at home lately. You want to spare them that agony. But the result is that the project relationship has been so challenging for this employee, and now he's visibly stressed out every time you see him. So again, does your intent meet your impact? No. What are we actually preventing when we avoid the conversation? What's so interesting, and many of us don't take time to consider this, is that by avoiding the conversation, because we're afraid we'll make matters worse or hurt someone's feelings, in an effort to be nice or to save someone from their embarrassment, we're guaranteeing more hurt and more frustration because we're not having the conversation, and it's a vicious cycle. So I want to take a closer look, because I think what I'm going to try to get into now is, what is this costing us? By not having these conversations, or by sidestepping the challenging issues because we don't want to be seen as too aggressive, or we want to be nice and be a team player, what's that costing us? What are the costs of being too nice? The first is talent. So when a manager is too nice to an employee who isn't performing, or a peer refuses to give feedback to another peer that isn't pulling their weight, the bar for what's acceptable drops and your talent pool follows. The underperformers aren't held accountable to their behavior, so their behavior continues and it festers, and the rest of the team begins to suffer as well. In fact, this is so fascinating to me. In recent studies, they have determined, being research organizations, have determined that the presence of one bad apple can cause the entire team's performance to drop by 30% and can cause other team members to adopt similar behavior. So poor performance actually begets poor performance. In addition, the employees who are performing well, the colleagues who are taking on the additional workload to make up for the lackluster performance of another, they become frustrated. They become resentful. They get demotivated. So relationships suffer, turnover is rampant, and the talent that you actually hold on to is probably not the talent that you want to be holding on to, because all the good ones leave. So there's very little growth and development, and this leads to number 2, productivity. Productivity suffers. So employees who aren't told what they're doing wrong or what they could do better understandably believe that they're doing great. Nothing's wrong. Nobody's telling me that anything's wrong. And they continue with the same behavior. So that leads to a plummet of productivity. Without the right skills or talent to do the work, it's harder to get the work done and to do it well. So managers who refuse to confront behavior end up settling for mediocrity. And a mediocre talent pool, as we know, leads to mediocre results at best. And finally, and perhaps the main reason we're even talking about all of this today, all of this leads to an effect on a company's ability to make money. Company's ability to make money. Clearly, low productivity, mediocre talent leads to a whole host of problems that affect the bottom line. So a business is not going to perform to their highest potential without the talent to get them there. Now, Russ Edelman, I don't know if any of you have heard of him before, but he's the president and CEO of Corridor Consulting, and he's the founder of Nice Guy Strategies, LLC. He conducted a survey of 50 top CEOs. And in that survey, he asked them what the cost to their business was for being too nice. Collectively, those CEOs responded by saying that being too nice in their business cost them roughly 8% of their gross revenue. Now, let's break that down, because for a business making $1 million a year, that's $80,000. And for a business making $10 million a year, that's $800,000. So according to these CEOs, being too nice was the inability to take initiative and go after being a better business, avoiding tough conversations with managers, with other business leaders, avoiding tough conversations with clients. And that's what caused their companies to miss out on opportunities that would have contributed, or at the very least saved them significantly, and their bottom line. So in the end, being too nice causes talent to decline, relationships to suffer, productivity to plummet, trust to erode, and really the bottom line to dwindle. And some of you may be sitting there right now thinking, well, this is great, Beth. I get it. There's a business case. There are some numbers we can put behind this. But you know what? My culture just doesn't encourage this. It doesn't encourage transparent, direct communication. So I can't have those conversations with my team, no matter what the cost. Or maybe you're thinking, well, if my company culture were different, then I'd have those necessary conversations. But it's not different, so I just have to deal with the consequences. So for those of you that are on this page, there's a bit of a news flash that I want to share, and that is that culture doesn't live outside of you. What does that mean? Culture doesn't live outside of you. You are the culture. You choose it in the conversations you have or you don't have, and even more so if you lead people, you're modeling it and reinforcing those choices every time you interact with others. So people are going to follow your lead. If you are not having the conversations, they won't have the conversations. If you start having difficult conversations with courage and skill, you will start to see people follow suit. So I want you to ask yourself this as we think about these conversations and as I introduce the skills today. What kind of culture do I want to be a part of in my company? What kind of culture do I want to be a part of? And more importantly, what does that require of me? What do I need to do? I mean, let's face it, there are definitely issues that are legitimately outside of our control. Even if we're leaders or individual contributors, there are some things that we can't have control over, but we do have the power to steer the culture in the direction we want it to go. We have the power to engage in conversations that can build the relationships we want and can get us results. So let me just transition here for a moment into fierce. And we have a belief here that we hold very strongly, and it's this. While no single conversation is guaranteed to change the trajectory of a career, a company, a relationship, or a life, any single conversation can. Any single conversation can. I want you to think about this quote, and I want you to think about how it relates to you. Specifically, when in your life has a conversation done justice? It's changed the trajectory of something for you. It changed where you decided to get your education. It changed what role you decided to take on or pursue. It changed a relationship that you had with someone. And I'm going to give you 10 seconds of silence to think about this, which some of you will not like me for and others will embrace. So give me 10 seconds of thought on that. When did you have a conversation that shifted something for you? Okay. So hopefully you have that in your mind. And in addition to that, I also want you to think about the last week, the last few days, the last month. When have you had, in the recent days, a conversation with someone that made a significant impact to them, to the team, to you? And there's two reasons that I ask you these questions. It's one, to begin to understand the power that conversations have in our lives, because they are powerful. And they do lend themselves to the results that we're looking for. Two is to consider how much you're actually taking the time to cultivate those conversations in your day-to-day. Are you slowing down to have the conversations? Or are you moving so quickly that those conversations get missed? Unfortunately, many of the conversations we know we ought to have are the ones that we avoid, we dodge, we ignore. whether it's because we don't want to have them or because we're just moving too fast and we forget. Some of the conversations we attempt to have don't go as planned, so our intent doesn't meet our impact, right? Sometimes our conversations or even our lack of conversations fail without our knowledge. We don't find out till it's too late, so we lose an employee. We think, what happened? Or a performance review goes bad. Sometimes we actually anticipate the failure, but we're still afraid to say something. So we're in a meeting and we think this is a horrible idea, that our client's going to suffer because of this idea. And we keep asking ourselves in our head, do I call it out? Do I ask? What if I'm the only one that feels this way? So I end up keeping it to myself. At Fierce, we know that conversations are the work of the leader. They're our job. And conversations are the workhorses of the organization. They're the catalyst for progress and change. It's simply put, what gets talked about, how it gets talked about, even who's invited into that conversation determines what will or won't happen in your organization. It's as simple and as maddeningly, I don't know what complex as you want to make it. But truly, what we talk about and how we talk about it determines what will or won't happen. Great leaders know this. So they invite those honest conversations, even if they're difficult, that are necessary in order to shift their culture from placating and being too nice and glossing over the issue to having the real conversations that get them the real results. So, and I know all of you are sitting there thinking, okay, great, now how do I do that? So what are those 3 fierce conversations that you and your team should be having to help shift that culture? What are the skills you can start practicing? That's what we're going to spend the rest of our time on today. The first one is the feedback conversation. So I recently conducted a client session with a team of directors, and on that team of directors, there was an IT director who very courageously, I might add, was really quick to point out that the reason he was taking this Fierce Conversations workshop was because of some of the feedback he'd been given by a new employee. The feedback was that he was too heads down and he was too out of touch with his team. He was also told that he abused email because he sent out all of his messaging via email. And that new employee shared that it was really hard for him to get clear on expectations or even gauge how he was doing without that one-on-one face-to-face interaction. Instead, he was getting one-way transactions over email. Even more, this employee shared with his director, this IT director, that there was a ton of confusion on the team about who was doing what. And there was actually an employee on the team that started to get so fed up that they were talking about leaving. Now, I want all of you to take a step back and think how many of you would have the courage to give that feedback to your boss, especially your new boss. Many of us, especially in a culture of nice, don't want to upset the apple cart. We want to be a team player, so we keep our frustrations to ourselves. We share it with a few carefully chosen colleagues in an act of what I like to call victim bonding. And yet, what are the implications of keeping that feedback to ourselves? What happens when we're not having the conversation? Consider this for yourself. Our careers, our companies, our relationships, our very lives succeed or fail gradually, then suddenly, one conversation at a time. What does this mean? What does this mean? Well, I think the sad news is that most of us don't wake up until suddenly. So it's the pain of suddenly that motivates us. We get a bad performance review, we lose a key employee, we lose a really great project or client or deal. Highly effective leaders, they get it. They get this, they understand this concept, so they track their trends. Every day they know that their results are either moving in the direction they want them to go or they're not. They notice that their team members are either productive, thriving, engaged, or their team members are confused and overwhelmed and floundering. And really good leaders know where their teams stand, and they use that information to course correct. So when something's off track, when the team isn't having or achieving their results, they pause and they have the conversation, even if they're not quite sure what the conversation needs to be about. Feedback, because we're talking about feedback conversations, feedback simply put, is a conversation in which we help ourselves and others stay awake during the gradually so that we arrive at our desired suddenly, not our undesirable suddenly. The employee who gave feedback to his IT director is a really great example of this, because the IT director was fortunate that the employee was tracking the trends for him. Without that feedback, the IT director could have stumbled into a very painful suddenly. He could have lost a key team member. He could have easily had his productivity plummet because too many people were doing the same thing or not sure what they were supposed to be doing. So this IT director, with that feedback, was able to track his trends and course correct. So let's ask the larger question. This is just one person, but how are we doing as a business community with giving feedback? Well, there's a recent survey by Gallup that says we still have a lot of opportunity. The survey showed that millennials, which, by the way, is the largest generation in the workforce today, they need and expect ongoing feedback. For those of you who study the generations or who have done any work around generations, and because I have a group of HR-minded people, likely you all have, but you know that already. That's not new. But what's more, only 19% of those people surveyed in this Gallup survey say they receive feedback routinely from their managers. Only 19%. And some have even said that this lack of conversation is what drives millennials to leap from job to job. So they're the generation most known for its lack of tenure in organizations, and when they're not getting the feedback or they're not able to develop as rapidly as they'd like, they leap. They jump to the next opportunity. So Gallup has told us we have opportunity to do more. What about hearing from this group? How are you doing? And here's another opportunity for a poll. I want you to tell me how you would rate yourself at having feedback conversations with your team. This is not how often are people having or giving feedback to you or having feedback conversations with you. This is how often are you having feedback conversations with your team. Here's your choices. I give myself an A. So I'm really diligent about having this conversation, even when it's the tough conversation to give some critical feedback. I give myself a B or C, so I acknowledge when these conversations need to happen, but I often find myself avoiding it, or I move too quickly and I don't take the time. Or I'm failing. So I'm having the conversation once a year at performance review time, and that is it. So I'm going to ask Sylvie to please launch our next poll so we all have an opportunity to contribute. And I want you to really think about this for yourself. Here again, we can't see your name attached to your answer, so be honest. How would you rate yourself? I give myself an A, B, or C, or I'm failing. And I'm just going to say that this does not surprise me so far, although I know we just got into this poll, but we've got a good number of people saying, yeah, I've given myself a BC. So I acknowledge when the conversation should happen, but I often find myself avoiding it. And then we've got some people who are really, and here again, we're working with an HR group, really diligent about having the conversations, may have skill already in giving feedback effectively, and they're taking the initiative. And then we have so far about 3 or 4% saying, yeah, I'm not doing such a great job. It's happening once a year. All right, so our numbers have drastically slowed. So Sylvie, if you could broadcast the results, that would be great. Everybody has an opportunity to see that. And you can see what I just said, which is the majority of people fell into that middle category, which is, I think, not surprising. And I want to just thank you for your honesty, because I think it's easy to say, oh, I'm doing it well. And I think we have to reflect a little harder on ourselves in order to say, no, I have some opportunity. Regardless of how you rated yourself, the important step that I want to highlight is to take time to carve out that time to reflect on what's happening around you. Identify who needs your input, right? Who do you need to give or receive feedback from that's going to be most central to your success? And I'm going to give you some fierce tips to doing this well. So from a high level, we know we need to be having these feedback conversations, but how do we do that and do it well? 2 fierce tips for you. The first is to check your assumptions. So when we choose to give feedback, one of the mistakes we often stumble into is that we make up stories about the other person, and then we behave as though those stories are true. So that's a problem. For example, I might be in a meeting with my team. I'm not the leader, only a contributor, but I begin to share my idea or my strategy to solve an issue that our team's currently facing. And I notice out of the corner of my eye that John, who's a colleague of mine, is slouched in his chair. He's yawning. He seems to be really disinterested in what I have to say. Now, John has a habit of doing this when I'm presenting. It's kind of annoying. He disengages. He doesn't give me feedback. He doesn't ask questions. He just stays silent and he avoids eye contact with me. So what story am I telling myself about John right now? Likely, I'm thinking, could he be any more of a jerk, right? So after the meeting, I say, you know what, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to give John feedback. So when I share with John what I experienced, he tells me he actually liked my ideas. He agrees with my strategy. And I think to myself, no way. He's just placating me. He clearly doesn't like me. He thinks my ideas are terrible. I mean, look at how he behaved in the meeting. So instead of furthering the conversation with John, I just end that conversation and go to another team member, Clark. And Clark was in the room for my presentation. He heard what was going on. And Clark believes that John really didn't buy into my ideas based on his behavior. And he may even be spreading seeds of doubt about my strategy because he didn't like it. So who do I believe in this situation? Do I believe John or do I believe Clark? Unfortunately, for many of us human beings, we tend to believe the latter, Clark, because his beliefs support our initial assumptions. And this is where I ask you to take caution. So for those of you who are familiar with Mark Sasser, who wrote the book Accountability Now, he says, my relationship with you can only be as good as the conversation I have about you in my head. So what if the conversation in my head is that you are a jerk or you need to change, right? Now, it could be true that John completely disagrees with my strategy and is a jerk who doesn't know how to work with people. It could also be true that John has a new baby at home. He hasn't slept for weeks. He can't stop thinking about all of the pressure that's happening and all the things he needs to do at home, and he's just wiped. Here's the point of all of this. The point is, unless we learn how to skillfully have this conversation, we may never know what the truth actually is. So what should I have done in my initial conversation with John? Instead of ending the conversation and running over to Clark, what I should have done is gotten curious. And it's a step I think many of us leap over. We almost assume that we've been curious because we've been kind of doing it in our own head, but we don't pause the conversation long enough to ask the questions. And instead of running to Clark to corroborate my viewpoint, I could have asked John 8 simple words. Can you tell me what was going on? Here's what I'm noticing. Can you tell me what was going on? How might that have changed our conversation? How might that have impacted the story I was telling myself about John and his support or lack thereof of my ideas? Can you tell me what was going on? Putting aside our assumptions, interrogating reality, that's hard. That's heavy lifting. So ask yourself as you're entering these conversations, as you're giving feedback, the first question before you even dive in is to ask yourself, am I making assumptions here? And if so, how do I check my perceptions and learn the truth? Am I focused on being right in the conversation? Or am I being in service to the person I'm giving feedback to? So tip number 1, check your assumptions. Tip number 2, ask for it. Now this can seem overly simple for some of you, especially those of you that do this and do it often. And of course, many times we sit and wait for feedback to come to us. I mean, we say to ourselves, if someone's bothered by something I'm doing, or if I'm not doing something right or well, they're going to tell me. They'll let me know. So a lack of feedback must mean I'm doing great. And when that becomes our inner dialogue, we miss valuable conversations and valuable insight. And we end up coasting blindly, and we probably get struck by that suddenly moment. So remember, you are the culture. And creating that culture of feedback, oftentimes it just seems so daunting to think about creating that culture of ongoing feedback, because so many people have to be involved So many people have to hop on the train and do it. And yet, if you aren't willing to hop on the train first, likely you are right, it won't succeed. So find out how your behavior, how your style, how your decisions are being interpreted by others. Model the behavior that you want to see and ask for it. How do you ask for it effectively? The first thing is to ask for specifics. And this is something I learned long time ago in my career. I had a wonderful leader who said to me, hey, Beth, you know, a general question is just going to get you a general answer. Because I think my question to him was, how'd I do? He said, what do you really want to know? How do you enter these conversations with more predetermined thought of what you want to achieve? Really think hard about what feedback you want to get. For example, what feedback do you have for me that's going to help me be more effective at how I lead our team meetings? Or what feedback do you have for me that's going to help me improve how I work with you, or how I work with this team, or how I communicate with this team? Now that said, and most of us find ourselves in this boat, we may not want to receive feedback from everyone. I mean, most of us gravitate toward those people who we know are going to give us the compliments or the attaboys or the pats on the back. And yet, as a reminder, real growth comes from the feedback that can be tough to hear. Ask yourself, if there's something I can learn about how I can be a better colleague, how I can be a more successful employee or a more effective boss, why wouldn't I want to know? Why wouldn't I want to know? It's not wrong to want positive feedback, but if you're hoping that people will only ever give you positive feedback, then I have a simple recommendation for you. Don't ask for it. Don't ask for it. Master the courage to ask for feedback. And ask yourself specifically these two questions. These are really great reflective questions for you as a leader. The first is, who would I most like to receive feedback from? And what do I specifically want to know? And then invite that conversation to happen. The second question is a bit trickier. Who would I least like to receive feedback from? And what am I afraid I might hear? Two really powerful questions to ask yourself, and then the next step is to invite that conversation to happen. And once you've asked for feedback, then the important thing is to sit back and listen. If you think about it from the other person's perspective, and we've all been there, how many of you have ever given feedback to someone with a true intent to help that person change for the better, and they didn't do anything differently? They didn't change because of it. What became your perception naturally? I mean, sometimes we lose respect for that person, or maybe we just feel like our opinion was not valued. Regardless, usually we develop some sort of a negative perception of someone if they receive feedback and they don't do anything with it, if they just dismiss it, which can really lead to not wanting to give that person feedback again, right? I mean, it can be scary to provide feedback to someone, especially when it's tough to hear. And if you muster the courage to give that feedback and nothing changes, well, that significantly decreases your desire to do it again, ever again. People who respond well to feedback really do tend to be looked upon favorably within their organizations. They appear to have higher emotional intelligence. Most people who are asking for this regularly do have higher emotional intelligence and seem to be genuinely interested in learning and improving. So, how do you work to receive feedback better? Right? I mean, we can all say, well, I ask for it. I even have leaders that say to me, well, Beth, I ask for feedback all the time from my team, and all I ever get is, well, you're doing great, or answers that really don't go very deep. My return question to that is, what was the situation the last time you received feedback that was tough to hear? What did you do with it, if anything, or what was your response? See? So as we're starting to think about asking for feedback, it's important to also prepare ourselves to show up to receive that feedback fully. All right, so feedback conversations. Number 2 is the confrontation conversation. As Robert Redford's character said, those of us who know Robert Redford as an actor, he was in the movie The Horse Whisperer, and in that movie, his character said, knowing something is easy. Saying it out loud is the hard part. Confrontation conversations are not easy. In fact, they're often the conversations we put off, we make excuses for, we avoid, we tiptoe around. We are that uncomfortable with them. And nice people, of course, avoid confrontation because it's simply uncomfortable. Of course, there are legitimate reasons to be scared about having some of these conversations, right? Let's be honest. I mean, some people don't react well when they're confronted, regardless of how thoughtful or eloquent we are in the conversation. That's reality. But what's also reality is the cost of not having the conversation is much greater than the risk of it going badly. The value of confrontation is that it helps us to solve problems. And as the saying goes, you get what you tolerate. So when we don't confront behavior, our results, the results of our team, of our organization, continue to suffer. We make it okay. So if you feel a conversation is needed in your gut, you think, I really have to have this conversation, likely it is needed. And for those of you that are worried about the conversation failing, just remember this. A careful conversation is a failed conversation because it just postpones the conversation that you know needs to take place. And there is a difference between being confrontational and skillfully confronting. One is aggressive. We talked about what happens a little bit through that poll when an organizational culture is too aggressive and there's fear and mistrust, right? The other, skillfully confronting, balances our need for action and results with empathy and understanding. So what do you do then to confront behavior with team members more effectively so that you're able to balance your need for action and results with that empathy and understanding? 2 tips. The first one is to deliver the message without laying blame. So this can be a little tricky. When we finally do have the conversation, oftentimes we overcompensate. So we say to ourselves, all right, I'm just going to muster up the courage to do this. I'm going to go in. I'm going to lay it on the line. I'm going to be done with it. It's going to be like ripping off a Band-Aid. If I do it vigorously and quickly enough, it's going to hurt a whole lot less. Wrong. It doesn't hurt any less. And likely, it won't succeed. Just the word confrontation usually evokes an adversarial reaction in people. Most of us, because we're uncomfortable with it, we arm ourselves or put on our armor before we go into the conversation. So when we go in that way, armed, armored, ready for battle, what does the other person tend to do? Well, they do the same thing, right? They go on the defensive or the offensive. We even use language that provokes this. We say, I'm going to go head to head or toe to toe with that person, which of course just leads to what I consider a boxing match of sorts, because I lay the first punch with my message, and then I continue to pummel this person with my perspective until I finally win. But do I really ever win? Do I really expect that when I enter a conversation this way, the other person's going to turn to me and say, oh my gosh, Beth, thank you so much for showing me the error of my ways. No one's ever done that. I'm going to go change. No. In fact, they fight back until we're both bloodied and bruised, and we have to stop the conversation. So if you're entering the conversation trying to prove that you're right and they're wrong, you are doomed to fail before you ever even begin. No one wins. So instead, what we recommend is that you enter the conversation with less declarative statements and more questions. And I know from experience in HR, as I'm sure many of you do, that asking questions is not something we're ever taught to do or do well. We're taught how to build our business case, how to state our opinion, but never how to really get curious. So asking questions is going to help us shift our context of this toe-to-toe, head-to-head confrontation and allow us to do this, to confront the issue rather than the person, which shouldn't be a question, it's a statement. Confront the issue rather than the person. That feels better, doesn't it, right? That this shift of context is going to help us create a partnership in the conversation instead of it having to be this battle or this one-way, I'm going to hit you with everything that I've got. So say to yourself, I clearly have my perspective, obviously, or I wouldn't be having this conversation. And it's imperative that I hear the other person's perspective as well, because remember, your intent here is to help the other person improve, not to send them packing. So tip number 2 is not to put pillows around it. This is really the opposite of that toe-to-toe mentality. So the first one was to deliver the message without laying the blame. Now we're saying don't put pillows around it. Those of us who don't want to hurt someone, those of us who do really want to be nice people, tend to put a lot of pillows around difficult messages. We say things like, well, I'm sure you didn't mean to do this, or maybe I wasn't clear. Perhaps it's my fault. And perhaps it is, but when we start to put a lot of pillows around a message immediately, the real intent gets absolutely lost, and the other person may not even hear what you really wanted or intended to say. I'll pause and share an example of this. In one of our Fierce classes, we had a woman who raised her hand and said, oh, I stepped into this big time. She said, I was firing someone for the first time in my career. And I sit them down. I was terribly nervous. And I also liked this individual as a person, but it just wasn't working out. So instead of going straight to the message, I started talking about everything this individual had contributed to date for the company. And somewhere through that, this individual started to think they were getting a promotion. She said it was awful, and I had to backpedal and tell them, in fact, it's just the opposite. So see, here again, if you like to be liked and you want to be seen as a nice person to those you work with, I want you to do something for me. I want you to start replacing the word nice with in service. Not how can I be nice to this person, but how do I be in service? Nice is saying what you think the other person wants to hear, what will make them feel good. Being in service is saying what you know this person needs to hear to improve themselves, the team, the organization, and to get better. There's something within each of us that really does respond to those people who can level with us, who don't suggest compromises for us. So be that person for your team. Engage in productive conflict, because while difficult, it makes for better performance, both for the individual and for the organization. It helps us solve problems and get better. So that's conversation number 2. And finally, conversation number 3 is the team conversation. So I want to start by asking you a few questions. These are not on your screen. So if you have pen in hand, actually take a step back, because I really want you to absorb these questions for yourself and reflect. So 4 questions to consider. The first is, how many meetings have you sat in where you knew the real issues weren't being discussed? How often do you find yourself, just to be polite or nice, saying things you don't necessarily mean? How would you describe the level of collaboration, alignment, and accountability on your team? And if nothing changes regarding the outcomes of your team conversations, what are the implications for your success or for your team's success? Those are big questions. And unfortunately, team meetings have the tendency to be a breeding ground for nice or agreeable behavior. Not always. I know some of you will probably push back and say, not on our team, especially those of you that said my organization is just too aggressive. That would be a different insight for us to share. But think about it. We've all been in that meeting where one person dominates the discussion and the rest of the team sits there in the land of what we like to call it fierce corporate nod, nodding their heads in agreement, not saying a word. And if you could peek into these team members' brains, those heads that were nodding, and read their thoughts, you'd read things like, oh my gosh, this is never going to work. Or, I can't believe she didn't ask me for my input before this meeting. Doesn't she know I'm the expert in this? Or, yeah, we've been down this road before. What a waste of time. Maybe if I sit here and keep nodding, this meeting will get over sooner. Team meetings are a place where nice prevails on the surface, but multiple competing perspectives are alive and well in everybody's head. So what's the problem when we stay on a level of constant agreement? Well, according to Jeff Bezos, which most of us know of, CEO of Amazon, he says being too agreeable can make you more susceptible to something called groupthink, which he goes on to say, groupthink is a group's tendency to ditch independent thought in favor of collective agreement. And teams with too many highly agreeable people on them tend to fall into this trap more often. Now, the danger in groupthink is that it stifles creativity. It stifles the ability to successfully problem solve, which makes for less than effective teams, if not just team meetings, and maybe why we find ourselves seemingly in the same meeting over and over and over again. I mean, have you ever gone mad or ever asked yourself, or here, didn't we have this conversation already? I thought we were here last week or last month. Have we not made progress? Here are some fierce tips for you to ditch that groupthink and help make your team meetings more successful. The first tip is to actively invite multiple perspectives. And the key to actively inviting multiple perspectives is actually twofold. One is literally having the right people at the table. And I think we stumble there sometimes. I'll talk about that in a minute. And two is to ensure all voices are heard. So number one, invite the right people. I'd like to ask you to think to yourself, what's your job as a leader? What's your job as a leader? Not what's in your job description, but overall, what's your job? I would contend your job as a leader is to make the best possible decisions that you can for your team and your organization, right? If we assume that's true, I want to put it to the test. Let's say you have a big decision to make for your team and you want to make the best decision possible. Who do you want in that meeting to help you make that decision? Who do you want to talk with? I'll share a few possible examples. One is people who know a lot about my department or business. That makes sense, right? People who get it. Two is stakeholders. So who's going to be affected by this final decision? I need them in the room. And three is people who think like me, people who are going to champion this effort, or people who kind of understand my line of thinking. These are the top three responses I get when I ask people this question. But it's important, too, to challenge our assumptions, talked about that, of who needs to be invited into these conversations. So what if we included the following as well? People I know who are going to challenge my perspective, argue my perspective. And people who don't know anything about my department or business. See, most of us tend to stick to our go-to invitation list when it comes to many of the decisions we need to make. And typically those go-to lists include people whose perspective is the same as our own. Trusted colleagues, team members, people that are on the same level of the organization as we are, people who think similarly to us. And this behavior is actually reinforced by science. So psychological research proves that our need to surround ourselves with people who think like us is hardwired to us as human beings. So while we may be aware of the benefits of seeking those alternate perspectives, it's just human nature to want to stick with what's familiar. Science almost gives us an excuse not to seek other perspectives. Yet the risk with like-minded thinking far outweighs our scientific tendencies. So we have to challenge ourselves to do that. The risk is that we have limited exposure to ideas and beliefs and a limited view of the potential that could exist. And that limited exposure just leads to limited results. We're not making the best decisions when we stick to our go-to list. So here's a challenge I have to you. If you're sitting at a computer, I'm actually going to give you permission to click out of my PowerPoint and click into your calendar. I want you to look at the next meeting that's on your calendar that has your team involved or a group of people that you're running. Who did you invite? And where is there opportunity to include others who have a unique perspective or a different perspective? Ask yourself, who is going to challenge me to make the best possible decision? And then add them to the invitation. So invite the right people. Number two is to ensure all voices are heard. So once you have the right people in the room, you need to hear from everyone. And I'll bet you've seen this happen in a meeting, or perhaps you've been the culprit. I would have to say I think I have been once or twice the culprit. The leader asks for input, and immediately one member, two members of the group start to give that input. And they don't either let people provide their opinion, that's sort of what it seems like on the outside, or others just simply sit quietly and think. Perhaps they never enter the conversation themselves, right? They're the quiet ones. So what's the problem with this? What's the problem when only the external processes are heard and we lose the perspective of people who may need more time to process? Many less dominant people really do see the undercurrent of your team or organization. They're doing all of that data collecting and computing, but now it's time to get the output, right? Their perspective can be invaluable. So the job of you as a leader is to allow the external processors that time, but also to create space for internal processors to express their thoughts without interruption. So you may need to ask a few team members directly for their perspective. Hey, Sarah, we haven't heard from you. What are your thoughts? Or you may need to tell somebody that's a little overly talkative to allow other voices to be heard. Hey, Beth, thank you so much. I appreciate your opinion, and I'd love to hear from a few other people. So in addition to hearing all perspectives, what's also important is for a leader not to discount the perspectives that have been shared. And the biggest culprit in this is this one little word, but. In fact, I encourage you to remove that word from your vocabulary as much as possible. Yes, but is essentially an eraser, and it's abused I think, by many of us on a regular basis, because it takes what the individual just said and it dismisses it. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard a leader say, well, yes, but we tried that 5, 10, 15 years ago and it didn't work. Or, that's an interesting idea, but I kind of like Joe's idea. Let's talk about that some more. Instead, how can you as a leader invite multiple competing perspectives to exist simultaneously? Get rid of the but. For instance, that's a very interesting thought. Can you help me understand how that idea is different than what we've tried to do in the past? Or yes, and what are your ideas to making that feasible today? Become aware of how your behavior is impacting the input of others and ensure that you're opening up the dialogue, not shutting it down, to gain new perspective. So the next time you're in a meeting, a team meeting, a brainstorming session, check in with yourself. Really ask yourself, how am I showing up? How am I showing up? First of all, do I have the right people here? And secondly, am I encouraging all voices to be heard? So I know we're getting to the top of the hour. I've been told we have a minute or two extra because the last session went late, but I also want to honor your time. So let me just quickly sum up where we've been and then hopefully toss it out for 1 or 2 questions. We've talked about the 3 conversations, specifically give and ask for feedback. So check your assumptions and ask for feedback. 2 is to confront behavior. Deliver the message without laying blame and don't put pillows around it. And finally, make it a true team conversation. So actively invite those multiple perspectives and ensure that all voices are heard. Invite the right people. When those real, open, transparent conversations happen, when leaders and employees are coming together to tackle those tough challenges, to ask questions, they're building a shared culture, and that increases engagement. It enables the whole team to take responsibility for that culture. And it shifts from needing to be nice and gloss over and pretend to getting the results we're looking for. So with that, for those of you who want to learn more, we have a wonderful free resource for you. It's a copy of our new ebook called 5 Conversations You Need to Start Having. If you text FIERCE to 72000, so I know many of you have your technology in front of you, go ahead, grab your smartphone, text it, and you'll get in return a copy of our new ebook, and it extends, it continues the conversation we were having today in this webinar. And with that, like I said, I know we're at the top of the hour, and if you're willing to stick around, we can take a couple of questions, and I'm going to actually ask my wonderful colleague from Fierce and Partner in Crime, Caitlin, who has been monitoring questions, to go ahead and toss out a question or 2 so I can try to take a stab at answering them. So Caitlin.
Hi, Beth. Thank you for that introduction. And we definitely do have a couple of questions. The first one is from Allison, and she was following up on the team conversation and said, is there a downside to always wanting to get buy-in from staff?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, right? Because the bigger question becomes, how slow do we let ourselves be, and will we ever get full buy-in from everyone? The beauty, and when I think about fierce conversations and specifically when we talk about team conversations, it's not necessarily getting consensus as much as it's getting down to collaboration. So I'm the leader. I really want to hear your perspective so that I can make the best possible decision, and does not necessarily mean that I'm going to need to get everybody agreeing in order to move forward. So I think the piece there is creating a culture where we're able to share our opinions and also know as a team that that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to move in the direction of the whole group. Because we might not always get buy-in from the whole group. So I think there is something to be said about how do we slow down to make sure that we're slowing down to speed up versus just derailing ourselves because we're saying we need buy-in. So when we talk about fierce team conversations, it's slowing down to have the conversations so that we can speed up and make the best decisions possible. It's a great question. Thank you. What else do we have?
Great, thanks, Beth. Would you be able to go back to the previous slide? We were getting a couple of questions about what the number is.
Of course.
Perfect.
There you go.
And then the next question is from Thea. She wants to know, how do you handle a person who doesn't realize they're too aggressive in their interactions?
Yeah, so we go right back to feedback. And that's a hard one because that's tough feedback for anybody to hear, that their impact is actually one of that's a little too aggressive. And a lot of the times when we're giving really insightful feedback, it can be feedback that people were completely blind to. So it will take time for them to even digest that and to come to terms with what does that look like? Because most people don't intend, I'm sure there are some people who do, but I would imagine most of us, even if we have the tendency to be a little aggressive, don't intend to be that way. We want everything that everyone else wants. We want to build those relationships and build that trust and make results happen. So it boils down to being able to give feedback and being able to give it in a way that's clear for the other person. I think by saying to someone, wow, you're just really aggressive, I'd ask you to think, if you got that feedback, what would be your reaction? So instead, breaking it down to say, hey, when you say X or when you do Y, here's the impact on me, or here's the impact on the team. And then to invite the other person to respond and enter into that conversation. So again, how are you showing up to giving that feedback? And that's really step number one. And with anybody, whether they're being too aggressive, whether they're not taking the initiative, which would be on the other side, it all boils down to how are you sharing that with them? How are you being in service to help them help the team, the organization, and themselves? Thank you.
Wonderful. Great. Building off of that, we've gotten a couple of questions around leaders. So if the feedback or the conversation is with your leaders, what if they are the problem?
You think so? I think sometimes that can be tough because in a hierarchical sense, and that's tough to give feedback up the chain, and especially when you feel like there's absolutely no tolerance for it. I would say, first of all, go back to what I said earlier, which is don't forget you are the culture. And I know some of you are going to put your hands up to me and say, yeah, but you don't know my boss or you don't know this leader. But I think it's really a matter of how are we giving our power away to the people that are preventing us from being successful as a team. And these are the tough conversations. How do you start to make inroads and take that power back in order to shift the culture? And that may be a series of feedback conversations, or that may be starting to get to know that individual leader on a different level so you can figure out how to be most in service to them and sort of removing the barrier that they're presenting. And also I would say sometimes this can be a block for us. We have to understand that a sea change of behavior and culture doesn't happen overnight. A lot of times we want to say, well, I had the conversation and it never worked. How quickly are we giving up on the change that we know is most critical to our success? And are we employing these conversations regularly and continually? It takes time, it takes practice, and it takes that stick-to-itiveness that's required in order to see a shift. And that may, you're dealing with someone who has spent their whole life showing up the way that they're showing up. So by saying, well, I had one conversation and they're not doing it, or they're not making the change, are you giving them credit? Are you supporting their shift of behavior and their development? Or are you kind of giving up on it? And it's the same up the chain of command. And that can be tough for some of us, but the same rules apply. We have to have the conversation in order for things to change. So great question. Great question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Beth. And I believe it's time for us to wrap up. I will be heading over to the virtual event booth if anyone has any further questions. And there's an option when you do text in for the ebook to set up a call with a fierce expert. So keep that in mind, and thank you.
Great, and I'll toss it back to Sylvie to wrap us up. So thank you all very much for your participation and attendance. We appreciate it, and Sylvie, wrap us up.
Well, thank you very much to Beth Wagner and to Caitlin Sorensen from Fierce for educating our audience today. We really appreciate your sharing your knowledge. Just a few reminders to the attendees. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archive recording and slides will be available for up to 7 days for our free members, and for our certification members, you have unlimited access. All webcast credits are stored in your HR.com account. Watch for your HR.com email to arrive within 1 to 2 business days, and that will contain your certification credit information. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that will appear on your screen once the webcast has ended. And as Caitlin mentioned, they are heading to the booth now, which you can find by going back to the trade show floor and then clicking on Exhibit Hall, and you'll find the booth there. Just click into that, and you'll be able to live chat with them and continue the conversation. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.